Wren Lancaster groaned as she stepped out of her sleek black sports car, her designer heels sinking instantly into the thick, unforgiving mud. Rain drizzled from the gray sky, soaking her cashmere coat as she surveyed the disaster in front of her car, wheels spinning uselessly, stuck deep in the muck of a backroad she never should have taken. "Perfect," she muttered, hugging her arms around herself. This was not how her day was supposed to go. A last-minute business trip had brought her to this rural town, and she'd decided to take a scenic route back. Big mistake. As she yanked her phone from her pocket, searching for a tow service, a deep voice called out from behind her. "You need some help." She turned sharply, startled, and her breath caught. A man stood a few feet away, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark flannel shirt clinging to his muscular frame. His jeans were worn, his boots caked in dirt, and his face, strong jaw, piercing blue eyes, tousled dark blonde hair looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine, not here in the middle of nowhere. Wren hesitated. "Yeah, my car's stuck." He studied the vehicle, then glanced back at her, his gaze lingering for just a second too long. "Yeah, I can see that. Do you have a truck?" she asked, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. "Or a tow cable?" The man let out a low chuckle. "Don't need one. I've got a shovel, some grit, and a little experience getting things unstuck." Before she could protest, he walked to the back of his truck, pulling out a sturdy shovel and a coil of rope. He crouched beside her car, assessing the damage. "You from around here?" he asked as he started digging around the tires. Wren hesitated. "No, just passing through." He nodded, not pressing further. His strong hands worked quickly, shoveling away the mud that trapped her tires. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, and Wren shivered. "You're freezing," he noted, glancing up at her. Before she could argue, he shrugged off his flannel shirt, revealing a plain white t-shirt underneath, and handed it to her. She stared at it. Just take it," he said, his voice firm. "You're turning blue." Reluctantly, she wrapped the warm fabric around herself, surprised by how comforting it felt. After a few more minutes of digging, he secured the rope to the front of her car, tying the other end to his truck. "All right," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Get in and give it some gas when I start pulling." She slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel as he signaled her. The truck roared to life, and slowly, inch by inch, her car emerged from the mud. Wren let out a relieved breath, stepping out once more. "You did it." He flashed her a grin. "Told you." She reached into her purse, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. Here, his expression darkened. "I don't need your money," she blinked, startled. It's fine," he interrupted, his jaw tight, "just helping out." Wren hesitated, something about his reaction intriguing her. Before she could press, a small voice called out from the truck. "Daddy." Her gaze snapped toward the open passenger door, where a little girl no older than 5 peeked out. She had golden curls and the same striking blue eyes as the man in front of her. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice softening. "Stay in the truck, okay?" She nodded, disappearing back inside. Wren looked back at him. "You're a dad." "Yeah," he said simply. Something about the way he said it, protective, firm, yet filled with unspoken weight, made her heart clench. "I should go," she said finally, though she found herself reluctant to leave. "But thank you," he nodded, stepping back. "Drive safe." She hesitated. "What's your name?" "Travis Kent," he said, his gaze steady. "Wren," she offered in return. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "See you around, Wren." As she slid into her car and pulled onto the road, she felt something strange settle in her chest. She had a feeling this wasn't the last time she'd see Travis Kent. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she wasn't sure she wanted it to be. Wren didn't expect to see Travis Kent again. She had told herself that much as she pulled away from the muddy backroad, her car finally free thanks to his stubborn determination. But something about their brief encounter lingered in her mind longer than it should have. Maybe it was the way he had refused her money, or maybe it was the way his voice softened when he spoke to his daughter. Either way, she should have forgotten about him. She didn't. Which was precisely why, days later, she found herself back in that small town, standing in front of a cozy diner with a flickering neon sign. It wasn't coincidence. Wren didn't believe in those. She had done her research, a habit she never quite shook from her years of clawing her way to the top of the business world. Travis Kent lived here, in this quiet town that smelled of fresh rain and pine. He co-owned a construction company, Kent and Sons, though there was no son in the equation, just him and a handful of workers. And for reasons she wasn't prepared to examine too closely, she wanted to see him again. The bell above the diner door jingled as she stepped inside. The scent of coffee and butter filled the air, and the low hum of conversation surrounded her. Most of the tables were occupied, and a few heads turned in curiosity as she walked in. She was used to that. She didn't exactly blend in her sharply tailored cream coat, and designer heels weren't standard attire in a place like this. She spotted him immediately. Travis sat at the counter, his back to her, broad shoulders clad in a dark Henley. A steaming mug of coffee rested in front of him. His daughter sat beside him, swinging her legs as she colored in a small book, her golden curls bouncing with each movement. Wren hesitated for only a moment before walking up to the counter. "You always rescue stranded women, or was I a special case?" He turned at the sound of her voice, surprise flashing in his blue eyes before settling into something unreadable. He didn't answer right away, just studied her as if trying to figure out why she was standing in this tiny diner when she so clearly didn't belong. "You found your way back," he said finally, his voice even. "Seems that way," she said, taking the empty stool beside him. His daughter looked up from her coloring book, her bright eyes curious. "You're the lady from the car," Wren smiled. "That's me." Travis leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "What are you doing here?" She could have said she was just passing through. She could have lied. But Wren had never been one for dishonesty, and something told her Travis would see right through it anyway. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, "and maybe buy you a cup of coffee." His gaze flickered with something she couldn't quite place. "You already tried to pay me, remember? This isn't payment, it's appreciation." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, but there was the faintest trace of amusement in his expression. Before he could respond, the waitress approached, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an easy smile. "Well, well," she said, giving Wren an appraising glance. "Don't think I've seen you around before." "She's new," Travis murmured. Wren extended a hand. "Wren Lancaster." The waitress shook it. "Maggie, welcome to the best diner in town." Wren glanced at Travis. "Is it the only diner in town?" "Pretty much," he admitted. Maggie chuckled. "You want coffee, sweetheart? That'd be great." As Maggie poured her a cup, Travis's daughter set down her crayon and looked at Wren seriously. "Are you Daddy's friend?" Wren glanced at Travis, whose expression gave nothing away. "I'd like to be," she said honestly. The little girl considered this, then nodded decisively. "Okay." Travis ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "Emma, finish your picture." Emma grinned and went back to her coloring. Wren took a sip of her coffee, then met Travis's gaze over the rim of her mug. "You don't trust me." His jaw tensed slightly. "I don't know you." "Not yet," she said, tilting her head. "But that's fixable." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing invisible scales in his mind. Finally, he leaned back slightly. "You're persistent. You have no idea." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but he didn't let it linger. Instead, he glanced at his watch. "I've got to get Emma to school." "And after that?" she asked. He hesitated. Wren lifted a brow. "You owe me nothing, Travis. But if you're curious about why I'm here, maybe you should find out." Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, can we see her again?" Travis exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. When he looked back at Wren, something had shifted in his gaze. "All right," he said. "I'll meet you at the park around noon," she smiled. "I'll be there." As he stood and guided Emma toward the door, Wren watched them go, a strange warmth settling in her chest. She wasn't sure what she was doing, but for the first time in a long time, she wanted to find out. The park was quiet when Wren arrived. A crisp breeze rustled through the trees, and the scent of damp earth lingered in the air from the recent rain. She found a bench near the playground and sat down, crossing her legs as she surveyed the scene. Children laughed as they climbed on jungle gyms, parents chatted idly, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. She wasn't used to places like this. The parks in the city were different, pristine, polished, filled with people who barely acknowledged one another. But here, there was a community, a warmth she couldn't quite put her finger on. She spotted Travis before he saw her. He walked with an easy stride, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jeans, his daughter skipping beside him, her blonde curls bouncing with every step. There was something about the way he moved, a quiet confidence that came from someone who didn't need to prove himself to anyone. Wren had spent her whole life around men who thrived on power, the kind who measured their worth in wealth and influence. But Travis was different. He carried himself like a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Emma spotted Wren first and ran ahead, her small arms swinging. When she reached her, she grinned. "You came?" Wren smiled. "Of course I did, I told you I would." Travis reached them a moment later, his expression unreadable as he studied her. "You're early," she shrugged. "I like to be punctual." Emma tugged on her father's sleeve. "Can I go play?" Travis nodded, and she took off toward the swings. He sat down beside Wren on the bench, stretching out his legs as he watched his daughter. "You don't seem like the type to spend your afternoon at a small town park," he said after a moment. She glanced at him. "And you don't seem like the type to make assumptions about people you don't know." His lips quirked slightly, but he didn't argue. Fair enough. For a few moments, they sat in silence, watching Emma as she climbed onto the swing set. The wind played with her hair as she kicked her legs, gaining momentum. "You never told me what you do," he said finally. She hesitated. Most men either knew who she was or found out quickly enough. But Travis, he hadn't asked until now, and she had a feeling his reaction would be different from what she was used to. "I run a company," she said simply. He didn't look at her, but she saw the way his jaw tightened slightly. "What kind of company?" "Real estate investments, commercial mostly, some residential." Now he did turn to her, his blue eyes sharp. "So you buy buildings and sell them for more than they're worth?" She raised a brow. "Is that what you think real estate is?" He held her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "I think people like you don't usually care about the people living in the buildings you buy." She stiffened, an unexpected sting settling in her chest. "That's a broad assumption." "Is it?" She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. "I didn't come here to argue with you, Travis." His gaze didn't waver. "Then why did you?" She hesitated, realizing for the first time that she didn't have a simple answer. "I don't know," she admitted. For a moment he said nothing. Then, to her surprise, his expression softened. "That's honest." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I try to be." He nodded slightly, then looked back at Emma. "She's my whole world, you know." Something in his voice made Wren's chest tighten. There was love there, but also something deeper, a weight she couldn't quite place. "Her mother?" she asked cautiously. His jaw tensed, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then finally he spoke. "She left." She waited, giving him space to say more if he wanted to. "Emma was barely 2, he continued after a pause. "Her mom decided she wasn't cut out for this life, packed a bag one night and never looked back." Wren's fingers curled slightly against her lap. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Don't be, I wouldn't trade a second of it." "Emma's the best thing that ever happened to me," she believed him. They sat in silence for a moment longer, the wind carrying the sound of children's laughter through the air. "So what about you?" he asked, breaking the quiet. "No husband, no kids." She let out a small laugh, though it lacked humor. "No, I've been a little too busy building an empire for all that." He studied her. "And is it worth it?" She hesitated. No one had ever asked her that. People admired her success, envied it even. But no one had ever questioned whether or not it had been worth the cost. "I don't know," she said finally. He nodded slowly, as if that answer told him more than she had intended. Emma came running back a moment later, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Daddy, can we get ice cream?" Travis glanced at Wren. "You like ice cream?" She smiled. "Who doesn't?" Emma grinned, grabbing both their hands and pulling them toward the small cart parked near the entrance of the park. As Wren let herself be led along, she realized something strange, something unsettling. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about business meetings or stock reports. She wasn't planning her next move or strategizing her next deal. For the first time in forever, she was just here, and she wasn't sure what to do with that. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Wren found herself standing outside Travis's home. She hadn't meant to come here, hadn't planned to extend her stay in this town, but something unspoken had pulled her back. After ice cream with Emma, Travis had walked her to her car, and she had expected that to be the end of it. Instead, he had hesitated before asking, almost reluctantly, if she wanted to have dinner with them. She had said yes before she could second-guess herself. Now, standing in front of his house, a modest but well-kept home with a wraparound porch and warm light glowing from the windows, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. It wasn't apprehension, not exactly. It was something softer, something she wasn't used to. The door opened before she could knock, and Emma beamed up at her. "You came," Wren smiled, stepping inside as Emma grabbed her hand and pulled her into the house. The scent of something warm and savory filled the air, and the space itself felt lived in, comfortable. A well-worn couch, shelves lined with books, a few scattered toys that had been shoved into a corner but not entirely hidden. It was a home, not just a house. Travis emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. His gaze flickered over her for a moment, assessing before he nodded. "Hope you're hungry." She followed him into the kitchen, where a pan of baked chicken rested on the counter, along with roasted vegetables and what looked like homemade biscuits. It was simple, but somehow more inviting than any five-star meal she had ever had. "You cooked all this?" she asked, surprised. Travis shrugged. "Emma eats better when I make it myself." Emma climbed onto a chair at the table, kicking her legs as she watched them expectantly. "Daddy's the best cook." Wren glanced at Travis, who only shook his head in mild amusement before pulling out a chair for her. She sat, and he took the seat across from her. Dinner was easy, surprisingly easy. Emma chattered about school, about her favorite books, about how she wanted a puppy but her dad said they had to wait until she was older. Travis listened, interjecting now and then, but Wren noticed the way he let his daughter take up space, the way he gave her his full attention. Somewhere between the laughter and the shared stories, Wren realized she felt more at peace here than she had in a long time. After dinner, Emma declared she was going to draw Wren a picture. She rushed off to grab her crayons, leaving Wren and Travis alone in the kitchen. Travis leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You don't seem like the type to stay in one place for long." She met his gaze. "I'm not," he nodded, as if he had already expected that answer. "Then why are you still here?" It was a simple question, but the answer wasn't simple at all. "I don't know," she admitted. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. "I think you do." Her pulse quickened. There was something in his voice, something quiet but sure. She swallowed. "Maybe I just like the way things feel here." His lips pressed together as if considering her words. "And how do they feel?" Wren hesitated, then finally said, "Easy." The word hung between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Travis reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent something electric through her. "This isn't your world," he said softly, "and I know that." She could have pulled away. She could have let logic take over, reminded herself that this wasn't what she had built her life around. But she didn't. Instead, she turned her hand, letting her fingers intertwine with his. "Maybe it could be," she whispered. His gaze searched hers, something unreadable flickering in those blue depths. Then, without another word, he stood, gently pulling her to her feet. They moved through the house in silence, past the glow of the kitchen, past the living room where Emma was sprawled on the floor with her crayons. The night air was cool as he led her onto the porch, the sky stretching endlessly above them, stars winking in the distance. He released her hand only to cup her face, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "You have a life out there," he murmured. "A big one," she exhaled, steadying herself, "and maybe I'm starting to realize that big doesn't mean better." His thumb traced her cheek, his touch grounding. "I don't want you to regret anything." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. She reached up, curling her fingers around his wrist. "The only thing I'd regret," she said softly, "is walking away from this before I know what it could be." Travis inhaled sharply, his grip tightening just slightly. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if giving her the chance to pull away. But she didn't. She sank into him, her hands sliding up his arms as his lips pressed more firmly against hers. It wasn't a kiss of urgency, it was a kiss of certainty, of something real. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath warm against her lips. Emma's voice suddenly rang out from inside. "Daddy, Wren, I finished the picture." They both laughed, the moment shifting but not disappearing. Travis cupped her cheek once more, his gaze steady. "Stay." It wasn't a command, it wasn't a plea, it was an offering. And for the first time in her life, Wren Lancaster didn't need to think before she answered. She smiled. Okay, Wren had never stayed anywhere longer than necessary. Her life was built on movement, on strategy. But here she was, still in the small town, still wrapped up in something she hadn't planned for. The next morning, she found herself in Travis's kitchen again, but this time, she had insisted on making breakfast. He had leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with barely concealed amusement. "You don't seem like the type who spends much time cooking," he observed. She cracked an egg into the pan, ignoring the way the butter sizzled loudly. "I can follow instructions just like anyone else," he hummed in response, but the teasing glint in his eyes remained. Emma, still in her pajamas, sat at the table, swinging her legs. "Daddy always makes pancakes on Saturdays." Wren glanced over her shoulder. "Then I guess I'll have to learn." Emma's grin widened. "You're staying?" The question was innocent, but it hit Wren like a weight she wasn't ready to carry. She glanced at Travis, who was watching her closely now. "I think I'd like to," she said carefully. Emma clapped excitedly, but Travis's expression was unreadable. Later that day, Wren found herself walking through town with him, the late morning sun casting long shadows on the pavement. The town was small, but it had its charm, with little shops lining the main street, their windows decorated with hand-painted signs. Travis stopped in front of a hardware store, nodding toward the window. "I need to pick up a few things for a project." She followed him inside, the scent of sawdust and metal filling the air. He moved through the aisles with ease, grabbing supplies with practiced efficiency. As she watched him, she realized how different his world was from hers. Simple, steady. There were no boardrooms, no high-stakes negotiations, just honest work. And yet it wasn't small, it wasn't lacking, it was full in a way she couldn't quite put into words. "You're thinking about something," he said, glancing at her. She exhaled, tilting her head slightly. "I'm realizing how much I've missed by never slowing down." Travis studied her for a moment before nodding toward the counter. "Come on." They paid for the supplies and stepped back into the sunlight. As they walked back toward his truck, Wren hesitated before asking, "Do you ever think about leaving?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted the bag in his hand and looked up at the sky, considering. "I used to," he admitted. "When I was younger, I thought about going somewhere bigger. But then Emma came along, and suddenly this place didn't feel small anymore. It felt like exactly where I needed to be." She looked at him, really looked at him. There was no regret in his voice, no longing for a life he never had. Just certainty. And for the first time, she envied that kind of clarity. That evening, they were back at his house, sitting on the back porch while Emma played in the yard. The air was warm, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and orange. Wren leaned her elbow on the wooden railing, glancing at him. "You think I could fit in here?" Travis took a slow breath, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee. "I think you could fit anywhere you wanted to." She turned toward him fully. "That's not an answer." His gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "I don't want to be something you try on for a little while just to see if it fits." The words settled deep, striking something she hadn't let herself examine. "I don't either," she admitted. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of crickets. Then Travis reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Then stay." It wasn't a plea, it wasn't an ultimatum, it was a choice, and for the first time in her life, Wren didn't feel the need to run. She squeezed his hand, her decision already made. Okay. Days turned into weeks, and Wren found herself slipping into a rhythm she never could have imagined. Mornings were spent with coffee on Travis's porch, watching the mist rise over the hills. Afternoons were filled with small-town errands, learning the ins and outs of a life that moved slower but felt fuller. Evenings were spent with Emma, who had taken to Wren as if she had been there all along. For the first time in years, Wren wasn't rushing to the next deal, the next meeting, the next achievement. She was simply living, but the past had a way of finding its way back. One evening, as she was leaving the town's bookstore, her phone buzzed in her purse. She glanced at the screen and saw the name she had been avoiding for weeks, James Cahill, her business partner. Answering meant acknowledging the world she had left behind, but ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. With a steadying breath, she accepted the call. "You've been off the grid for too long," James said, skipping pleasantries. "I let it slide at first, figured you needed a break, but Wren, you can't just disappear. We have deals waiting, investors asking questions." She glanced across the street, where Travis was helping Emma tie her shoelaces. The sight of them sent something warm through her, but James's words were a sharp reminder of the life she had built. "I haven't disappeared," she said carefully. "I've just been reassessing," James scoffed. "Since when do you reassess? You're the most calculated person I know. There's a multi-million-dollar project waiting for your decision. You think you can just walk away from all of it?" She turned slightly, watching as Travis lifted Emma onto his shoulders, her laughter ringing through the evening air. "Maybe I can," she said softly. A stunned silence followed. Then James's tone shifted from frustration to disbelief. "You're serious?" "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted, "but I know that rushing back to the life I had before doesn't feel right." James exhaled heavily. "Just tell me one thing." "Is this about a guy?" Wren closed her eyes briefly. "It's about me." Another pause. Then, reluctantly, James said, "All right, but don't take too long figuring it out, Wren. The world doesn't wait." She ended the call, gripping her phone tightly. The world didn't wait. But maybe, for once, she didn't have to chase it. Later that night, as she sat on Travis's porch, he joined her, handing her a glass of wine without a word. She accepted it, watching as the stars stretched endlessly above them. "You were quiet at dinner," he observed. She took a slow sip before setting the glass down. James called. Travis's expression didn't change, but she could tell he was listening carefully. "He reminded me of everything I left behind," she continued. "The company, the deals. The expectations." Travis leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "And do you miss it?" She thought about it, really thought about it. "Parts of it," she admitted. "I built something from the ground up. That means something to me." His gaze remained steady. "But does it mean enough to leave?" The question settled between them, heavy and unspoken for too long. She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "I don't want to lose this." Travis reached for her hand. His grip was warm, solid. "Then don't." She looked at him, really looked at him. "You make it sound simple." "It is." His voice was quiet but sure. "You don't have to choose between success and happiness, Wren. You just have to decide what success looks like to you." Her breath hitched slightly. "And what if it looks like this?" Travis's fingers tightened around hers. "Then stay." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned in, pressing her lips to his, sealing the decision she had already made in her heart. The following week, Wren made the call. She wasn't walking away from everything she had built, but she was restructuring it. Handing over more control to James, stepping back from the relentless pace, choosing a balance she had never allowed herself before. And she was staying. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Travis took her hand as they walked along the quiet streets of town. They passed the park where they had first truly talked, the diner where she had bought him coffee, the bookstore where she had realized that small moments could hold just as much weight as big victories. Then, just as they reached the steps of his porch, he turned to her. "Marry me." It wasn't a grand production, no rehearsed speech, no elaborate setting, just a man looking at her like she was his entire world. Her breath caught, and for the first time in her life, she had no hesitation. "Yes," she whispered. Emma squealed from the doorway, having overheard, and ran to wrap her arms around Wren's waist. Travis pulled them both into his arms, holding them close as the world quieted around them. And for the first time in her life, Wren Lancaster knew she was exactly where she was supposed to be.